She ironed his shirts on Sunday nights, every single Sunday, for 11 years. She picked up his dry cleaning. She made the lamb. She arranged the flowers. She set the table 3 times until the forks were right. She did everything a good wife does. And while she was doing all of it, he was having lunch at a white tablecloth restaurant with his billionaire boss's wife. Every Tuesday, for 14 months. Not 4 months, not a recent mistake. 14 months of choices. 14 months of Tuesday lunches and wine, and a woman who wore sandalwood and amber and never once had to try very hard at anything. And here is the part that will stay with you. When Caroline finally found out, she did not scream. She did not throw things. She did not fall apart. She turned off the kettle. She made 2 cups of tea. She set one in front of him. And she stood at the counter and asked him, in a voice cold as January, "You ended it, or she ended it." The silence that followed was its own answer. But that is not even the story. The story is what happened next. Because the man who had been betrayed, the billionaire whose wife had done the betraying, he called her. And what he offered her was something she never saw coming, something she could not refuse. Stay with me. Because this is a story about what a woman finds when she finally stops holding up a life that was never really hers. Lesson line. When you stop building someone else's dream, you finally have both hands free to build your own. If you have ever ironed someone's shirts on a Sunday night while something quietly broke inside you, this story is for you. Hit subscribe so you never miss the ones that matter. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever known something was wrong long before you let yourself know it? And if this sounds like someone you love, share it with her. She needs to hear how this ends.
The perfect summer evening, the wine glass rang out against another, a clean, bright sound. A toast? Caroline Marsh was standing in her own dining room, holding a glass of Burgundy she could not quite afford, smiling at people she barely knew. The table was set perfectly. She had set it herself. 3 times, actually. She kept adjusting the forks, moving the water glasses half an inch to the left, stepping back, moving them half an inch to the right. The flowers were fresh. She had picked them up at 6 in the morning before school. Grocery store flowers, white and yellow, nothing exotic. She had arranged them herself in the blue ceramic vase that sat on the windowsill the other 364 days of the year. The lamb had been in the oven since 2 in the afternoon. That meant she had left her 4th grade art class 5 minutes early. She had felt guilty about it the entire drive home. 22 children, still working on their color wheels, still mixing red and yellow into orange that looked more like rust. She had left them with the classroom aide and told herself it was fine. It was not entirely fine, but tonight mattered. Tonight was the dinner. Drew had been talking about this dinner for 3 weeks. His boss was coming. Nathaniel Holt, the one whose name appeared on the building downtown, on the investment fund, in the financial press every other Tuesday. Nathaniel Holt, whose net worth had 7 zeros attached to it, who could promote Drew into a position that would change everything. That was exactly how Drew had said it. Change everything, Caroline. Just try to make a good impression. That is all I am asking. She had tried. She was still trying. The table had 6 candles because she could not decide between 4 and 8. The good dishes wear out. The ones from the wedding 11 years ago that they had used maybe 15 times since. The linen napkins were ironed. She had ironed them at 5:45 in the morning, in her pajamas, before Drew was awake. She did not want him to see how much effort she was putting in. She did not want him to know she was nervous. She was nervous. The doorbell rang at 7 o'clock exactly. Nathaniel Holt was not what she had expected. She had expected someone polished to the point of coldness, someone who would walk through her front door and look at her sensible kitchen and her non-designer dress and her grocery store flowers and make her feel the distance between his world and hers without saying a single word. Instead, he was quiet. He noticed the flowers first. He said they were lovely. He said it the way a person says something they actually mean. No flourish, no performance, just the word, given plainly. His wife, Vivian, noticed nothing. Vivian Holt was 44 years old and looked like she had been assembled by a team of professionals, which she probably had been. She was wearing a dress that cost more than Caroline's monthly salary. She smelled like something warm and expensive. Sandalwood, maybe, or amber resin. She had the particular quality of a woman who had never been required to try very hard and who knew it without being cruel about it. She was not unkind. She was simply somewhere else, even when she was standing right in front of you. The wine was opened. The conversation began. Drew poured. He laughed too loudly at everything Nathaniel said. He leaned forward in his chair when Nathaniel spoke, the way a plant leans toward light. Caroline watched her husband, and then, just once, for half a second, she watched him watch Vivian. It was nothing, a glance, the kind of thing that a person with a less careful eye would never catch. But Caroline had always had a careful eye. It was what made her a good art teacher. She noticed things, the way color shifted at edges, the way a shape changed when the light moved. She filed the glance away. She did not examine it. She poured more wine and asked Nathaniel about his work. The dinner was lovely. Nathaniel complimented the lamb twice. He asked Caroline about her students. Drew had mentioned she was a teacher, and Nathaniel seemed genuinely curious, not politely curious, which was a distinction she appreciated. They talked about a boy she had who drew the same red barn in every single assignment, every week, the same brown roof, the same white fence, the same dog sitting by the gate. Nathaniel laughed, a real laugh from deep in his chest. She liked him for that. Vivian checked the phone once, then again. She ate very little. At 10:30, their guests stood to leave. Nathaniel shook Drew's hand and thanked Caroline again for the dinner. He said it was one of the best meals he had eaten in a long time. He said it looking at her directly, which she noticed. Then they were gone. Drew was electric in the way he always got when something went well for him. He wrapped his arms around Caroline from behind while she stacked the dishes and pressed his face against her hair. "That was perfect," he said. "You were perfect. I think that went really well. Don't you?" She did. She was happy. She should have been entirely happy. Everything was exactly as it appeared to be, almost. Because later, much later, when Drew was asleep, she stood at the kitchen sink, washing the wine glasses by hand. She was too careful to trust them to the dishwasher. They were thin. They had been a gift from her mother. She washed them one at a time, holding each one up to the light before setting it on the drying rack. The water was warm. The kitchen smelled like rosemary and garlic and the fading edge of a good evening. She looked at her reflection in the dark window above the sink. She looked fine. She looked tired, but fine. And then, without meaning to, she thought about the glance, just for a moment. Then she put it exactly where it belonged. Nowhere. In the dark. It meant nothing. He always looks at beautiful women, she told herself. That is just Drew. That is just how he is. It has never meant anything, and it does not mean anything now. She dried the last glass. She turned off the light. She went to bed. Outside, the September night was warm and still. The grocery store flowers on the dining table had already begun to close for the night. petals pulling inward, keeping whatever warmth they had left. She did not think about the glance again, not that night. 3 weeks passed. Life looked the way it always looked. Drew went to work. She went to school. They had dinner together 4 nights out of 7. They watched television on the couch with the sound low and the lamp on in the corner, the way they had done for 11 years, the way she had always found comfortable. Drew got the promotion, not the big one. A lateral move with a better title and a modest raise, which Drew described as a stepping stone. He was happy. She was genuinely happy for him. She made a reservation at the Italian place on 5th Street, where they used to go for their anniversary before the budget got tight. They split a bottle of Chianti, and he told her about the new role, and she listened and asked the right questions and thought that this was what a good marriage felt like. Steady, mutual, warm. That night, over pasta, she asked about Nathaniel Holt. Drew said he barely interacted with the man directly. His day-to-day was with the senior vice president, someone named Gerald. Gerald was perfectly fine, but not particularly interesting. Nathaniel operated at a different level. She nodded. She ate her pasta. She stopped thinking about it. Except she did not, quite. And she would not have been able to say exactly when the not quite began. Small signs in a warm season. Here's what she noticed over the next 2 weeks. It was nothing. She would tell herself later, many times, that it was nothing. Not individually, not as a list. But she noticed it all the same, in the way she noticed everything, in the quiet and careful way she had always moved through the world. Drew started going to the gym at 6 in the morning. He had never gone to the gym at 6 in the morning, not in 11 years of marriage. He had a gym membership that he had renewed every January for 3 years and used perhaps twice each time. He said Gerald liked to see everyone at their desks by 8, so he was adjusting his schedule. He said this easily, reasonably, without being asked. She nodded. That was reasonable. He bought a new cologne. She mentioned that she liked the old one. It had been a birthday gift. She had picked it out herself 2 years ago, standing at the department store counter for 20 minutes deciding. He said he just wanted something different, a change. That was reasonable too. He texted at dinner on a Tuesday. Just briefly, he glanced at his phone, typed something short, set it face down on the table. He said it was Gerald. She did not ask to see it. She was not the kind of person who asked to see her husband's phone. She had always believed that was a boundary worth keeping. He mentioned Vivian Holt once. In passing, something about a charity fundraiser the company had sponsored, where Vivian had been the honorary chair. He said she had been impressive, organized, good with people. That was all he said. 3 sentences. And then he moved on to something else. She moved on too. She was at school the afternoon her body registered something, her brain was still refusing to name. She was supervising an art project. 12 children trying to paint self-portraits, which always looked approximately like a crime scene. And she realized that her hands had been cold for 20 minutes. Just cold, for no external reason. The classroom was warm, the radiator was on, the afternoon sun was coming through the south-facing windows. She was cold anyway. Stop it, she told herself firmly. You are doing the thing you do. You are finding problems where there are none. Her best friend, Patrice Wheeler, was waiting for her in the faculty break room at lunch. Patrice had been Caroline's closest friend since they were both 24 years old and hired to the same school in the same week. Patrice as the school counselor, Caroline as the art teacher. 11 years of shared lunches and shared coffee and shared everything that 2 women share when they spend more waking hours together than apart. Patrice was professionally trained to notice what people were not saying. She noticed immediately. She said, "What is going on?" "You have the face." Caroline said, "What face?" Patrice said. The face you had, the time you found that credit card statement you did not know about, 3 years ago. That face. Caroline said nothing was going on. She described the gym schedule, the new cologne, the mention of Vivian. She said it all in a calm, organized way, the way she described problems to herself when she was trying to talk herself out of them. She said, I feel like I am imagining things. Patrice was quiet. The break room hummed. The coffee maker gurgled. Someone had left a birthday card on the table, half signed, and it lay there between them like a prop from a more ordinary day. Then Patrice said, You are not crazy, but I also do not know yet what you are not crazy about. You need more information. That was the most useful thing anyone would say to Caroline for the next several weeks. She did not act on it. That evening, while Drew was in the shower, she sat on her side of the bed and looked at her phone. The shower was running. She could hear it through the wall. She could hear him humming, that low, tuneless humming he did when he was in a good mood. He had been humming a lot lately. She opened her phone. She typed, Signs your husband is having an affair. She read 3 lines. Then she closed the tab. Then she opened it again. God, she thought, what am I doing? What is wrong with me? She closed it again. She opened a recipe website instead. She started planning next week's dinners. Tuesday, pasta. Wednesday, soup. Thursday, something with chicken. That was a thing she could do. That was a thing that made sense and stayed inside the lines. The shower shut off. The pipes knocked once in the wall. Drew came out with a tulle around his waist, smelling like that new cologne, and she looked at her recipe screen and said nothing. Nothing at all. The following week, she found the receipt. She was not looking for it. She wants to be clear about that. Even now, she was hanging up his dry-cleaned jacket. The charcoal one, the good one, the one she had dropped at the cleaners herself on Monday morning. She was smoothing the shoulders, the way she always did, and slipping it onto the hanger, and she felt the small, stiff rectangle in the inside pocket. She pulled it out. Lorraine. A Tuesday, $212, 2 glasses of Côte de Rhône, appetizers, 2 entrees, 1 dessert, 2 people, a 2-hour Tuesday lunch. She stood there holding the receipt. His jacket still smelled like the new cologne. She put the receipt in the pocket of her own cardigan. She hung up his jacket. She smoothed the shoulders again, both hands moving automatically, the way they always moved. She stepped back and looked at the jacket hanging there perfectly straight on the hanger. She thought, I wonder how long I've been taking care of things that were already gone. She did not look at the receipt again until 3 in the morning. She sat at the kitchen table, in the dark, her phone screen the only light, and she looked up Chez Laurent, white tablecloths, a prix-fixe menu. The kind of restaurant where lunch took 2 hours and cost $200, and you ordered wine, because that was simply what one did there. Drew did not drink wine at lunch. He never had. She put her phone down. She picked it up again. She thought of every reasonable explanation she could generate, one after another, the way you work through a problem with no good solution. A client, a business development contact, Gerald, who seemed to exist only in contexts where she was not meant to ask further questions. She thought, there is a reasonable explanation. There is always a reasonable explanation. She thought, tell me this is reasonable. She went back to bed. She did not sleep. Drew was sleeping the way he always slept, deeply, effortlessly, on his back, one arm thrown out toward her side. She lay next to him and listened to him breathe. The bedroom curtains she had sewn herself caught the streetlight at their edges. She had made those curtains on a Sunday afternoon 3 years ago while Drew watched football downstairs. She remembered being happy that afternoon, the hum of the sewing machine, the smell of coffee, the specific quiet pleasure of making something with her hands. She had been happy. She wanted to find her way back to that. She breathed in, she breathed out. She waited for nothing specific, in the dark, next to a man she had loved for 11 years, with a receipt in the pocket of her cardigan folded over the chair in the corner. The restaurant window, she gave herself one more week. In that week, she watched carefully, and she watched the way a person watches when they are hoping to be proven wrong. She was not building a case. She was looking for the exception, the thing that would make it all fit together into something benign. She did not find the exception. She found more questions. Drew came home late on a Wednesday and said he had been at a client dinner. He named a client she had heard him mention before, a hedge fund with a long name she could never quite remember. He seemed relaxed, normal. He ate the dinner she had kept warm for him and told her about the traffic on the way back. She listened. She said the right things. She looked at his hands on the fork. She thought, I know this man. I have known this man for 11 years. I know the difference between normal and performed. This was performed. She could not prove it. She could not point to any single thing and say, here, this is the lie, this is the seam. It was the whole texture of the conversation that was wrong. Too smooth, too easy. Like a man who had been practicing for a test he knew was coming. She nodded at the right moments. She poured him water. She went to bed before him and lay in the dark and thought, I am going to find out this is nothing. And then I'm going to feel terrible for doubting him. And then everything will go back to being fine. She wanted so badly for that to be true. She woke up on Thursday morning and drove to school and taught her children about perspective. How the same object looks different depending on where you are standing. How distance changes everything. How a house looks small from far away and enormous when you are standing inside it. Elliot, her most difficult student, 9 years old and perpetually furious at the world for reasons that probably had nothing to do with art, looked at his drawing and said, but which one is the real size? She said, both of them. They are both real. It depends on where you are standing. He looked at her with the particular suspicion of a child who suspects an adult of telling the truth. She thought about that for the rest of the day. Tom. The second piece arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. She was not looking for it. She was driving to the craft supply store to buy glitter. Elliot had finally completed an assignment without crumpling it. The first time in the entire school year. And she had promised him glitter as a reward, because glitter was the currency of the 4th grade art room. She did not particularly want to buy glitter. Glitter got into everything. It showed up for weeks in unexpected places, tiny points of light in corners and on chairbacks, proof that something celebratory had happened. She was thinking about glitter. She was not thinking about Chez Laurent. And then she drove past it. The restaurant was on the corner of Meridian and 5th, with large front windows that faced the street, and she was stopped at the red light directly in front of those windows for exactly long enough. She saw them, Drew and Vivian Holt. Vivian was wearing a cream-colored blouse. Her dark hair was up. She was saying something, and she had one hand on the table. With her fingers slightly spread, the gesture of a woman, making a point she is certain of. Drew was leaning forward, elbows on the white tablecloth, his whole body angled toward her. She knew that lean. She had been the reason for that lean once, across tables in restaurants she could actually afford 12 years ago, when he looked at her like she was the only thing in the room worth looking at. The light changed. She drove. She did not slow down. She did not stop. She drove the 4 blocks to the craft supply store and parked in the far corner of the parking lot and sat with both hands on the steering wheel and looked at the dashboard. The clock read 3:27. She watched it change to 3:28, 3:29, 3:30, 3:31, 3:32, 3:33. She sat in the car for 11 minutes. She counted every one of them. She did not cry. She did not do anything. She sat very still and breathed and watched the numbers on the clock change with the mechanical indifference of time, which does not stop for anything, not for joy, and not for the particular devastation of a parking lot at 3:30 in the afternoon. Then she went inside. She bought the glitter. She drove back to school. She found Elliot, and she gave him his glitter, and she told him it was the best work she had seen from him all year, and she meant every word of it. He looked at her with the same suspicious attention he always gave her, and then he said, "Can I put it on the planet?" She said, "You can put it wherever you want. It is your planet." He put it on the rings. Silver glitter, pressed carefully into the wet paint with one finger, going slowly, taking his time. A purple planet ringed with silver. She watched him do it. She was also somewhere else entirely. That evening, she drew herself a bath. Not a shower. A bath. She only did this when something was wrong enough that she needed to be somewhere small and warm and enclosed. She used the lavender salts her mother had given her for Christmas, the ones she had been saving for some unspecified future occasion. She took them out of the cabinet and used them without ceremony, pouring them in while the water was still running, watching them dissolve. She got in with her school cardigan still on. She did not mean to. She sat on the edge and then slid in, and the wool went dark and heavy with water, and she just let it. She sat in the warm water in her wet cardigan, and she breathed. The bathroom was small. The steam made it smaller. The mirror fogged over entirely within 2 minutes, which meant there was nothing to look at except the ceiling, which was white and plain and required nothing of her. The faucet dripped. Once, twice, a small sound in a very small space. She watched the ripples from each drop spread and flatten and disappear. She thought about the first time she met Drew. She was 26, a work happy hour. She had almost skipped because she was tired, and she had an early class the next morning, and she was already halfway home when she turned around. He had been funny, genuinely funny. Not the performing kind, not the look-at-me kind. Self-deprecating and sharp and directed entirely at her, like she was the most interesting person in the room. She had felt visible. She had liked being visible. When did I stop being visible? She thought. Was it gradual? Was there a specific Tuesday when it happened, and I just did not notice? She sat in the cooling water for 35 minutes. The lavender rose with the steam. She breathed it in. She got out. She dried off. She put on her oldest pajamas, the blue striped ones, soft from 100 washes. She made toast and ate it, standing at the kitchen counter, tasting it properly, present for it in a way she had not been present for a meal in weeks. She did not call anyone. She did not look at her phone. She went to bed. She slept, surprisingly, for 7 hours. The third piece was not physical evidence. It was a phone call. She was in her classroom, after the children had gone, tidying up the supply table, capping markers, and sorting brushes by size, when her phone rang from a number she did not recognize. She almost did not answer. Then she thought of the school administrative lines she never had saved, and she picked up. The voice on the other end was a woman's voice, low, deliberate, choosing each word carefully, the way someone chooses words when they have rehearsed a speech and are still not entirely sure they should be giving it. The woman said, "Mrs. Marsh, my name is not important. I work in a building where your husband has been spending time that he has not told you about. I am not going to give you any details. I am only going to tell you one thing." A pause. "You are not wrong," the woman said. "Whatever you think you have seen, whatever you have been wondering about, you are not wrong." Then the call ended. Caroline stood in her classroom in the quiet after-school hush, with the supply table half tidied in front of her, and the color wheels drying on the back wall, and Elliot's purple planet, with its silver rings sitting on the windowsill where she had put it to dry. She held the phone with both hands. Her ears were ringing. I am not crazy, she thought. I know what I saw. She said it out loud to the empty classroom. I am not crazy. I know what I saw. The clock on the back wall ticked. She had wound it that morning, the way she did every Monday. It was 22 years old, that clock. It had been in this classroom before she arrived, and would be here after she left. She found a strange comfort in that. She wound it now, even though she had already wound it this morning. She picked up her bag. She drove home. The drive took 14 minutes. She did not turn on the radio. The silence in the car was full, not empty, not peaceful, but full from wall to wall with everything she had been carrying and everything she now had to decide. Drew was on the phone when she got home. She could hear him as she came through the front door, his voice from the bedroom, the door pulled almost closed, not quite shut. She hung up her coat. She set her keys on the hook. She did not move closer to the bedroom door, but she caught the end of it. 4 words, just before he heard her key in the lock, and went silent. This has to stop. She went to the kitchen. She started making dinner. He came out 5 minutes later, already performing normal. He was very good at performing normal. She had not known, until recently, quite how good. He kissed her cheek. He asked how her day had been. He opened the refrigerator and stood in front of it for a long time, looking at the contents like a man who had forgotten what he was searching for. She stirred the pot on the stove. She said, "Good. Busy. How was yours?" He said, "Same old." She nodded. Her hands were steady. They had been steady all day. She could not explain it. She had expected herself to be shaking. She was not shaking. She was clear and cold and very, very steady, like water that has been sitting in a still place long enough to go completely transparent. She set the table. She called him for dinner. They ate. Building the case in silence. She waited 6 more days. Not because she was uncertain. She was not uncertain. The certainty had settled into to her in the parking lot of the craft store at 3:33 in the afternoon, and it had not moved since. It was there when she woke up. It was there when she taught. It was there when she sat across from Drew at the dinner table and passed him the salt and asked about his day and listened to his answers. She waited because she was building something. She called her mother first. Sandra Keene picked up on the second ring, which she always did, had always done in 42 years of being Caroline's mother. Caroline registered this fact with a sudden force she had never properly appreciated before. Her mother always answered on the second ring, steady, without drama, present. She said, "Mom, I think Drew is having an affair with Nathaniel Holt's wife." A long pause. Her mother said, "I know." She said, "You know?" Sandra said, "I did not know the details. I have known something was wrong for 2 months. You had the voice." She said, "Patrice said the same thing." Sandra said, "Patrice is a smart woman. Now listen to me. Do you need a lawyer before you say anything to him?" She had not thought that far ahead yet. She had been so focused on the knowing that she had not yet arrived at the after-knowing. The place you end up when the thing you suspected becomes the thing you know. So she said, "Yes, I think I probably do." Her mother gave her a name, Margaret Finley, a friend of a friend, a divorce attorney, someone Sandra described as the kind of woman you want on your side. She called Margaret Finley that same afternoon. Margaret had a voice like a clear winter morning, not cold, but precise, unambiguous. She told Caroline 3 things, and she told them in order. 1, do not move out of the house. Not ever, not for any reason, not no matter who asks. 2. Document everything quietly. Dates, times, what she saw, and exactly when she saw it. 3. Do not tell Drew she knows. Not yet. Not until she had something worth telling. Caroline said, "How long?" Margaret said, "A week. 2 at the most. Can you do that?" She thought about the parking lot. She thought about the clock. She thought about the bedroom door and the 4 words she had caught at the end. She said, yes. She did it in 8 days. She photographed the receipt from his jacket and emailed it to herself with the date and time in the subject line. She wrote down what she had seen through the restaurant window. The address, the approximate time, a description of what each of them was wearing. She saved the anonymous phone call in her log with a note beside it. Unknown caller claims to have direct knowledge. She printed the call log from her phone carrier's website and folded it into the folder she kept in the bottom of her school bag under the stack of student worksheets, where he would never look. She noted the way he answered her 2 casual questions about Vivian Holt, once at dinner, once during a television show. Both times he answered quickly, smoothly, like a man who had rehearsed the casual version of the answer and was waiting for the non-casual version of the question. She noted everything. She was so calm it frightened her slightly. She had expected grief. She had expected the floor to fall away. Instead, she felt distilled, reduced to something essential and clear, the way a sauce reduces on the stove. All the excess cooked off. Just the concentrated truth remaining. On the 9th evening, she came home from school and set her bag on the kitchen table. She took off her coat and hung it on the hook. She filled the kettle and put it on the stove. She stood at the counter and she waited. Drew came in from the garage at 6:15, smelling like cold air and the cologne she had come to associate with a version of her husband she did not fully know. She turned to face him. She said, "How long have you been having an affair with Vivian Holt?" She said it the way she might say, "How long have you had that dry cleaning?" Plainly, directly, without a tremor. He stopped walking. The garage door was still hissing shut behind him. She watched his face cycle through expressions the way a slot machine cycles through combinations. Surprise, calculation. Something that might have been genuine grief. Then the partial mask coming down, the face of a man deciding which version of the truth to use. He said, "What?" Not a denial, a request for time. She said, "I have been watching you for 6 weeks. I have a receipt from Chez Laurent. I have a date, I have a phone log, and I have my own eyes." He said her name, just her name, the way you say the name of something you can see breaking and cannot stop. She said, "Do not do that. Do not make this about managing how I feel. I am asking you a direct question." He sat down at the kitchen table. He sat heavily, like something structural had given way inside him. He put his face in his hands. He said, into his hands, in a voice she had never heard from him, "It started 4 months ago. I ended it 2 weeks ago." The kettle began to scream. She turned and lifted it off the burner. She poured 2 cups of tea. She did it automatically, from 11 years of muscle memory. From the 10,000 times she had made tea in this kitchen at this time of evening. She set 1 cup in front of him. She held the other in both hands. She did not sit down. She stood at the counter and she said, "You ended it, or she ended it?" A pause that lasted long enough to answer the question before he spoke. He said, "It was mutual." She said, "That means she ended it." He said nothing. She nodded once, the nod of a woman receiving the last piece of information she needed. She said, "Does Nathaniel Holt know?" His head came up sharply. He said, I don't think he knows." She thought about this man who had complimented her grocery store flowers, who had laughed at the story of the Red Barn, who had looked at Vivian across the dinner table with the expression of a man who has made peace with a grief that has no clean resolution. She said, "He knows. He absolutely knows." She picked up her cup of tea. She walked out of the kitchen. She went upstairs. She sat on the small wooden step stool she kept in the closet for reaching the top shelf. She pulled the door almost closed. In the dark, surrounded by the smell of his pressed suits on one side and her winter coats on the other, she sat and breathed. In, out. The suits were pressed. She had pressed them herself on Sunday evenings, on the ironing board in the corner of the bedroom, Sunday after Sunday after Sunday, pressing the shirts of a man who had been spending his Tuesday lunches at a white tablecloth restaurant with someone else's wife. She sat in the dark and she breathed. Starting over feels impossible, she thought. She said it out loud, quietly, to the hanging fabric and the cedar smell and the silence. Starting over feels impossible. But staying is worse. She sat there for 22 minutes. Then she got up. She went to the guest room. She stripped the bed and put on fresh sheets, the ones with the small white flowers that had been folded in the linen closet for 2 years, waiting for a guest that never came. She tucked herself in carefully. She turned off the light. She slept for 7 hours. The folder on the coffee shop table. She almost did not call. The text arrived from a blocked number the morning after the confrontation. It said, "Nathaniel Holt would like to speak with you at your convenience. This is his direct line." She stared at it for a long time. Then she put her phone in her pocket and drove to school. She told Patrice about it at lunch. She told it plainly. The blocked number, the precise formal phrasing, the oddness of "at your convenience" from a man whose time was worth more than most people's entire annual salary. Patrice set down her coffee cup. She said, "That is either the most interesting thing that has ever happened to you, or the strangest." Caroline said, "Both." Patrice said, "Are you going to call?" She said, "I do not know what he wants." Patrice leaned forward across the table. She had a way of leaning forward when she had been patient long enough and had arrived at the place where patience had to give way to directness. She said, "His wife slept with your husband. You both got played by the same two people. He wants to talk to the only other person on earth who knows exactly what his living room feels like right now." Carolyn thought about this. She sat with it through the rest of the school day. She sat with it during the drive home. She sat with it while she made dinner for one. Drew had taken his things to the guest room by mutual, wordless agreement. And while she ate alone at the kitchen table with the radio on low. Then she called. Nathaniel Holt answered on the second ring. His voice was the same as she remembered from the dinner, measured, unhurried, not performing ease, but genuinely at rest inside himself. He thanked her for calling. He apologized for involving her in something she had not chosen. He said he understood completely if she preferred not to continue the conversation. And there was a full, clean stop at the end of the offer. No pressure behind it. She said, "Why are you calling me?" He was quiet for a moment, the quiet of thinking, not stalling. Then he said, "Because I believe you are making decisions right now. Legal decisions, financial decisions, and I have information that is relevant to those decisions. And because I was sitting in my kitchen last week and I thought about you standing at your sink washing the wine glasses after the dinner. You were the only person in that room that evening who was fully present. I thought you deserved to have someone be fully present for you." She did not know what to do with that. She said, "What information?" He said, "Can we meet in person? There's a coffee shop on Meridian. Neutral, public. Tomorrow at 8 in the morning, if that works for you." She said, "8 is fine." The night before the meeting, the legal war began. Drew had hired an attorney. Margaret called to tell her. She used the flat, careful tone of a woman who has learned to remove alarm from her voice without removing honesty, and she explained that Drew's attorney had already been in contact, which meant Drew had made this call before Caroline had confronted him. Before, she said. He started preparing, before I said anything to him. Margaret said, "Yes," she said, which means he expected this. He planned for it. Margaret said, "He managed his exposure. I want you to understand what that means. This was not an impulsive mistake. Your husband assessed the situation, identified the risk, and took steps to protect his position. You were the variable he was managing." She sat on the edge of the guest room bed, her bed now, and held the phone. A managed risk. She was a managed risk. 11 years of marriage and 2 people and a shared life and a kitchen where she made tea at 6:15, and she was the variable being managed. Somewhere along the way, she thought, I became invisible. Not to him. I was always visible to him. But as a person, as someone with my own future, I became a line in his calculations. She said it out loud in the guest room, to no one, in the dark. Then she lay down and stared at the ceiling and listened to the water heater cycling on and off in the wall, and she fell asleep eventually from pure exhaustion, and she did not dream. She met Nathaniel at the coffee shop at 7:58. He was already there. He stood when she came in. It was such an old-fashioned thing to do, to stand when a woman enters a room, that she almost smiled. Almost. He looked different without the context of a formal dinner. Dark wool sweater, no tie, coffee already in front of him. He looked like a person instead of a reputation. She sat across from him. He slid a folder across the table before she had finished removing her coat. He said, "I want to be clear. I am not asking anything of you. I am not proposing any arrangement. I am giving you information that is simply yours to have." She opened the folder. It was a financial summary. She did not understand every line of it, but she understood enough. Drew had been listed as a beneficiary on a series of transfers from a private trust. A trust in Vivian Holt's name, separate from the marital estate, controlled entirely by Vivian. Small amounts, irregular intervals, but consistent, for 14 months. She read the dates twice. 14 months. He had told her 4. She closed the folder. Her hands were flat on the table, completely still. She said, "He lied about the length." Nathaniel said, "He lied about a great many things. He said it without pleasure, without apology either. Just the plainness of a man who has come to terms with a fact he wishes were not true." He said, "Vivian has a pattern. This is not her first time. I will spare you details that are not yours to carry. What matters for your situation is this. Your husband was not swept away by something he could not control. He made choices. 14 months of choices. He accepted money. He knew what it was, and he took it." She looked at the folder on the table between them. She said, "This is enough for Margaret." He said, "More than enough. My legal team has prepared the documentation. Your attorney will have everything by this afternoon." She looked at him then, truly looked, the way she looked at things when she wanted to understand them fully, the way she had trained herself to look over 20 years of looking at art. 49 years old, shadows under his eyes that had not been there at her dinner table in September. No pretense whatsoever. Just a man in a coffee shop on a Wednesday morning who was also trying to figure out how to hold himself together. She said, "Why are you helping me specifically? What do you get from this?" He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He said, "Vivian will attempt to use Drew in our proceedings. A sympathetic figure, a man she led astray, a willing participant who can be framed as a victim. She has done this before. A second wronged party with independent legal standing and their own documentation complicates that strategy in ways that are useful to me." She nodded. She said, "So we are useful to each other." He said, "We are. But I also meant what I said. about the sink, about you deserving someone to be present for you. She picked up her coffee. She drank it. Outside the window, the first real cold of the season had arrived overnight. The last leaves were gone from the trees on the sidewalk. The branches were bare and black against a flat white sky. The hardest part, she thought, is admitting I knew all along. She did not say it out loud, but thinking it felt like setting down something she had been carrying for a very long time, like her arms could finally rest. She picked up the folder. She put it in her bag. She thanked him. She went back to her life, which was no longer the life she had woken up in 3 weeks ago, and she began, slowly, one careful decision at a time, to figure out what the next one would look like. The longest winter, the legal proceedings moved fast after that. Not fast the way things move in movies. Fast the way real divorces move, which is to say in lurches. Long stretches of waiting, interrupted by sudden bursts of paperwork and phone calls and decisions that required her full attention at times when she had none left to give. Drew's attorney was aggressive. He sent a letter through Margaret characterizing Caroline as financially dependent on Drew's income and emotionally unstable since the separation. Standard language, Margaret said, over the phone, in her clear, winter morning voice. Do not react. Do not give him a single thing to point at. She taught her classes. She drove to Margaret's office. She sat in a conference room where 2 attorneys discussed her marriage in financial terms while she drank water from a paper cup and listened and took notes on a legal pad in her small, precise handwriting. She signed things. She read things. She learned more about marital asset law in 6 weeks than she had ever wanted to know. One Tuesday night, it was nearly 2 in the morning, she could not sleep. She got up and reorganized the entire closet. She did not plan it. She simply woke up and the closet was there, and she needed something she could control, and so she pulled everything out. Every item, examined, every decision made. 2 garbage bags for the thrift store, a silk blouse she had forgotten she owned, a cardigan she had been looking for since October of the previous year. She put the cardigan at the front, where she would see it. She hung everything back up. The cedar smell of the wooden hangers, the silky weight of the blouse, the soft scratch of wool against her fingers. She worked through the night with the closet light on and the rest of the apartment dark, and by 4 in the morning, the closet was perfect, and she felt, not fixed, but capable, like a person who can make something orderly in the middle of disorder. She went back to bed. She slept for 2 hours. She woke up and made coffee and drove to school. Patrice brought her dinner on a Thursday. She just showed up at the door with a container of soup and a bottle of wine and no expectation of anything except to be let in, which Caroline did. They ate soup at the kitchen table that was now entirely Caroline's, and drank 1 glass of wine each, and talked about everything except the divorce for approximately 9 minutes before Patrice said, "How are you actually doing?" Caroline thought about it seriously before answering, which was how she treated all of Patrice's real questions. She said, "I am okay. I am more okay than I expected to be." Patrice said, "That is because you are stronger than you know," she said. Or, "I am in shock, and the real thing has not hit yet." Patrice said, "Maybe both." They finished the soup. They did not talk about Drew. There was not much left to say about Drew that served any useful purpose. After Patrice left, Carolyn stood at the kitchen sink and washed the 2 bowls and the 2 spoons and the 2 wine glasses. The water was warm. The kitchen was quiet. She looked at the window above the sink. Not her reflection, not this time, just the dark glass. The world outside reduced to nothing visible. "I deserve better than this," she thought. She said it quietly, to the window, to the dark. "I deserved better than this when we got married. I deserved it every year in between, and I deserve it now. She dried her hands. She went to bed. Drew asked for a meeting in January, not through the attorneys. He called her directly, which Margaret had advised against, but which Caroline agreed to anyway. She could hear in his voice that he needed something from her. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something adjacent to it, some acknowledgement that she had received his apology as intended. She agreed to meet him in the living room of the house on a Sunday morning before it went on the market. The winter light came through the east windows the way it always had. That light did not belong to either of them. It would keep coming through those windows after they were both gone from this house. Drew sat on his side of the couch. She sat on hers. He said, "I want you to know I'm sorry." She said, "Okay." He said, "I mean it, Caroline. I mean it completely." She said, "I know you mean it. Right now, in this room, you absolutely mean it." He looked at her. She said, "That is not the same as it mattering." He looked like she had struck him, though she had not raised her voice. She had not moved at all. She said, "Drew, you were with her for 14 months. You accepted money from her. You hired an attorney before I ever said a word to you. I can hear your apology, and none of those things become different because of it." He put his face in his hands. She watched the light move across the floor, slow, steady, indifferent. She said, "I deserve better than this. I always did." She stood up. She went to the kitchen. She made coffee. She made enough for two. Automatically, from pure habit, from 11 years of Sunday morning coffee made for two people in this kitchen. She brought him a cup. She set it on the table in front of him, without a word. Then she took her own cup to the window and stood looking out at the yard. The garden was bare. The rosebush she had planted 4 years ago was nothing but a network of brown thorns right now. It would bloom again in May. It always did. It did not know or care what had happened in the house beside it. She drank her coffee. She thought, "I am going to be all right. Not fine. Not fixed. Not the same as before. But all right." Something in her, something she would not be able to name for another several months, had already turned toward whatever came next. Quietly, without announcement. The way a plant turns toward light. Not because it decides to, but because that is simply what it does. The night the winter broke, the divorce was final on a Tuesday in March. Margaret texted at 11:47 in the morning. 2 words. "It's done." Caroline was in the supply closet at the time. She had gone in to restock the colored pencil sets before the afternoon class, and she was standing there among the construction paper and the dried-out markers and the particular smell of school glue, a smell she had always associated with the feeling of possibility, with mornings and beginnings. When her phone buzzed in her pocket, she read the 2 words. She stood very still. She breathed in the smell of the supply closet. She closed her eyes for a moment. It's done. 11 years. A house, a name she had hyphenated onto her own and would quietly unhyphenate now. A Tuesday morning in March with colored pencil sets in her arms and the smell of school glue around her. She put her phone in her pocket. She restocked the colored pencils. She went back to her classroom. 22 new children were waiting for her. Or not new. They had been hers since September, but new in the sense that she was still learning them, still finding the key to each one. She walked around the room and looked at what they were making, which was self-portraits, because it was always self-portraits at some point in the year, because there was no better assignment than asking a person to look at themselves and make a decision about what they saw. She stopped at Elliot's table. He had painted himself with purple hair and gold eyes, things he did not have, things he very clearly wished he had. She looked at the painting for a long time, at the deliberate way he had chosen these colors, at the confidence of the brushstrokes. She said, "That is exactly right, Elliot. That is exactly you." He looked up at her. With the suspicious attention he gave all compliments. He said, "It doesn't look like me. My hair is brown and my eyes are green." She said, "It looks like the you that is in there." He looked at his painting. He said, "Oh." Then he went back to it, adding a small detail to the background, a purple sky she saw to match the hair, with the particular focus of a child who has just understood something important and wants to keep understanding it. She moved on to the next table. She taught the rest of the afternoon. She drove home. And that was the day the divorce became real, not as a legal event, but as a fact of her life. And she was still standing at the end of it, and her hands were still steady, and she went home to her own apartment. The one she had rented in February, second floor, west-facing windows. And she made dinner for one and ate it at her own table and thought, "I built this. This is mine. I made this from nothing, and it's mine, and it is enough." The house sold in April. Her share was more than Drew had planned for. Margaret Finley did not lose. She deposited most of it into an account at a bank she had never used before, in only her name, for the first time in 11 years. She sat in the bank lobby afterward and looked at the small card with the account number printed on it. The number was modest. The mine was enormous. She had moved into the apartment in February, carrying her own boxes up the stairs in 2 trips. 3 trips for the books. Her arms had ached for 3 days after. She had found the aching satisfying in the way that real physical effort is satisfying. Proof that you have done something actual with your body, moved something real from one place to another. The apartment had west-facing windows that caught the afternoon light in a way that still surprised her. She had chosen it partly for those windows, standing in the empty space on a cold February morning, with the winter light coming through at an angle that turned the bare hardwood floors the color of honey. She had thought, this is the right one. She had been right. She painted the kitchen walls warm sand the weekend her mother came down. Sandra Keene drove 4 hours each way with a set of paint rollers and the particular energy of a woman who has been waiting to be useful and is finally being given the chance. They painted on a Saturday, talking about everything and nothing, the radio on in the background, the smell of paint sharp and clean in the small kitchen. They ate takeout on the floor that evening because the table had not arrived yet. It was coming from an estate sale, a round one with a small scar on one side that Caroline had loved on sight. Her mother looked at her across the takeout containers and said, "You look different," Caroline said. "Different how?" Sandra said. "Lighter, like you put something down," she had. She just could not yet name exactly what it was. What grows after winter, Patrice came the following weekend with wine and opinions. She had strong opinions about the bookshelf placement. She was also correct. They moved it together across the hardwood floor, not gracefully, scraping it in a long arc from the east wall to the south wall. And when it was in its new position, they both stepped back, and Patrice said, "There, obviously." They sat on the floor with the wine. Patrice said, "I have been sitting on something for a long time." Caroline waited. Patrice said, "I never liked him." Caroline said, "I know." Patrice said, "You knew?" She said, "I knew you never said you liked him. With you, that is the same as saying it." Patrice raised her glass. Caroline raised hers. They drank. The bookshelf stood across the room, full of Caroline's books, in Caroline's apartment, in the late afternoon light that came through the west windows at the exact angle she had loved from the moment she saw it. The table had arrived by then, the round estate sale table with the scar on one side, that she faced forward deliberately because there was no reason to hide an honest mark. She looked at the room. She thought, I made this. This is what I made. She saw Nathaniel again in May. Not entirely by accident. He had mentioned at the coffee shop in October that his company sponsored a fundraiser for the City Arts Foundation each spring and that he sat on the board. He had said she might find it worthwhile as an art teacher. He had said it in the way he said everything, without pressure, as an offering, take it or leave it. She went. She told herself it was because the Arts Foundation funded programming in public schools, and she should know her donors. This was true. It was not the whole truth. He was there. He saw her from across the room. He did not come over immediately. He was mid-conversation with a board member, and he finished it before moving toward her. She noticed this. The finishing of the conversation before crossing the room. A small thing, the kind of small thing that is actually not small at all. He made his way to her with no urgency and no performance, holding a glass of sparkling water. He said, I am glad you came. She said, I almost did not. He said, I know. That is why I am glad. They stood together and looked at the student artwork on the walls. She realized gradually that it was all from city public schools, from classrooms like hers, a small girl's painting of a yellow house with smoke coming from the chimney, a teenage boy's abstract in red and black that was almost entirely feeling with almost no form, and was the better for it. She said, Do you know what I teach them? I teach them to put down what is really there, not what they think should be there, not what looks right from the outside, what is actually there. He looked at the yellow house for a moment. He said, That must be harder than it sounds. She said, It is the hardest thing in the world. A pause. He said, I think about our conversation at the coffee shop. Fairly often. She looked at him. She said, So do I. He said, I am not going to pretend I don't know what that means for me. But I have no expectations. I know what your year has been. I know what mine has been. So, I want to ask you something simple. He said, Would you like to have dinner sometime? Not a coffee shop, an actual dinner. I know a place with very bad lighting, an extraordinary pasta, and no one will see us there, or make it into something it is not. She thought about Chez Laurent, white tablecloths, Drew leaning toward Bille Vivienne in the warm restaurant light. She thought about grocery store flowers that a man had called lovely, and meant it. She said, Yes, simply, without qualification, without finding the nearest exit. Yes. The dinner was in June. The lighting was exactly as bad as advertised. The pasta was extraordinary. She laughed 3 times and did not count any of them because she was not monitoring herself, because she did not need to. He told her about Oliver, his 17-year-old, who was processing the separation through silence and through music. Always music, whatever sounds the most deliberately bleak. She asked what kind. He named a band she did not recognize and described it with such unguarded love for his son that something shifted in her chest. Some tightly held thing releasing. She told him about Elliot and the purple planet with the silver rings. He listened the way he had listened at her dinner table in September, with his full attention, as though there were nothing else competing for it, as though this were the only conversation happening anywhere in the world. She told him about painting the kitchen walls warm sand with her mother, about eating takeout on the floor, about the table that had not arrived yet. He said, That sounds like exactly the right way to start something new. She said, It felt right. He walked her to her car at the end of the evening. No gesture beyond that, no assumption. He said at the door of her car, Thank you for yes. She laughed. She drove home. In the apartment, the west windows were dark, the afternoon light long gone. She sat in her good chair. the one from before the marriage, retrieved from her mother's storage unit, where it had been waiting for her, patient as a good thing always is, and she looked at her apartment in the quiet dark. I built this, she thought. This is mine. She was tired. She was also, unexpectedly and without fanfare, happy. Not the careful, tended, please hold kind of happy she had performed at the dinner table a year ago. This was something quieter, more evenly distributed through her body, like warmth that has settled into a room after the heat has been on for hours. You stop noticing the source and just notice that you are warm. She fell asleep in the chair. She did not move until morning. The proposal September came. A new school year. 22 new fourth graders, or not entirely new. Several had been hers before, moving through the grades, but a new configuration of them, a new classroom ecology to learn. Elliot had moved on to fifth grade. She missed him with a specific, fond sharpness that confirmed she had done her job. New faces, new self-portraits that looked like crime scenes in all the right ways, new small disasters with paint, and new small miracles that she watched for in the particular way she had always watched for them. From the corner of her vision, sideways, because sometimes the best things happen when no one is looking directly at them, she was glad to be there. Genuinely, entirely, completely glad. The year retaught her something she had been quietly surrendering for a long time. The classroom was not the thing she did when her life was elsewhere. The classroom was her life, this work, these children, the daily alchemy of handing a person a brush and a color and the permission to put down what was actually there, not what they thought should be there. She had let the noise of other things convince her it was secondary. It had never been secondary. It had always been the center. She began thinking seriously about the district arts coordinator position. It had been posted in August, and Patrice had sent her the link 3 times before Caroline had actually opened it and read it through. The role was citywide: curriculum advocacy, funding outreach, partnership development with cultural institutions. It would mean fewer classroom hours and more work at a level of influence she had not previously considered for herself. She had not previously considered it because she was not the kind of person things like that happened to. She was aware of this belief. She was aware that it was not accurate. She was working on the distance between awareness and actual change, which turned out to be significant and required daily attention. Patrice said she would be extraordinary at it, in the decisive way Patrice said things she believed completely. Margaret Finley, who had become, somehow, a real person in Caroline's life rather than just a professional, agreed. Sandra Keene called from 3 states away to agree before Caroline had even mentioned it to her, which was either maternal intuition or Patrice had sent her the job listing too, which was equally possible. She was drafting her application on a Saturday morning in late September at the round estate sale table with the scar she had placed forward when Nathaniel called. He said, "I have something I would like to discuss with you. Can I come to you?" She said, yes. He came to the apartment at 10 o'clock. He had been there twice before, and he did not look out of place in it, which she had noticed both previous times. He fit in her apartment the way people fit in places where they feel no need to perform a version of themselves. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, and he set both hands flat on the surface, and he said, "I want to propose something to you, and I want to say something first before I propose it. Your answer, whatever it is, will not affect the other thing between us. The dinner thing, that is entirely separate. I want that to be completely clear before I say anything else." She said, "Nathaniel, what is it?" He said, "The Arts Foundation is restructuring its education program. They are creating a new director position. Citywide responsibility, full-time, a real operating budget, complete autonomy over curriculum design and school partnerships. I am on the board, but I am not the employer. The foundation is independent, and the board votes on all hires. I cannot hire you, but I can advocate for you, loudly, specifically, to the people who can make the decision, if you want it. She looked at him. He said, I have listened to you talk about your work for the better part of a year. I know what you do in that classroom with almost no institutional support and almost no resources. I know what you built this year from nothing in your own life. I watched you dismantle a life that was wrong for you and build one that was right without waiting for anyone's permission and without flinching. That quality, the combination of it, the art and the rebuilding both, that is what this position needs. That is not something you can hire from a resume. The September morning light came through the west windows. It was different from the summer light. Sharper, the angle changed, a degree or two more golden. It caught the scar on the table and made it silver, running honest and clean across the wood. She had faced it forward deliberately. She thought, put down what is really there. She said, I want it. He nodded once, the nod of a man who had expected this answer. She said, and I need you to understand something. He waited. She said, if I get this position, when I get it, it will be because I am the right person for it. Not because of you, he said. I know that. The board will know that. I am not the reason. I am the introduction. That is a different thing. She said, yes, it is. She said, okay. She said it again, more quietly. Okay. And then she smiled. Not the dinner party smile she had worn a year ago, in this same autumn. Not the careful smile she had maintained through the winter. The real one. The one that was just hers. The one she gave Elliot when he put silver glitter on a purple planet and did not yet know it was extraordinary. He saw it. He smiled back. The light moved across the table. The scar caught it and held it. She got the position. The process took 3 months. A formal application, a panel interview, a portfolio review, a presentation to the full board that she prepared alone in her apartment at 6 a.m. over coffee, with the west windows still dark and the city quiet around her. She was nervous the morning of the board presentation. She sat in her car outside the foundation offices for 4 minutes before going in. She looked at the dashboard. She thought about parking lots and dashboard clocks. She thought about counting minutes while her world came apart. She thought, I can do this. I have done harder things than this. She went in. She gave her presentation. She answered every question clearly and directly and without qualification. She went back to school and taught her afternoon classes. Margaret Finley sent white peonies, extravagant and perfect, when the offer came. Patrice cried, which she denied with complete conviction for approximately 30 seconds before the conviction collapsed. Sandra Keene called at 7 a.m, before Caroline was fully awake, to say, I always knew. I knew from the time you were 6 years old and you sat in the kitchen and painted a picture of the garden and refused to let me look at it until it was done. You always knew exactly what you were doing. You just needed the room to do it. She held the phone and listened to her mother's voice. She thought, I have not been properly grateful for this woman. I am going to be properly grateful from now on. She said, thank you, Mom. Sandra said, don't thank me. Just stop being surprised when good things happen to you. She said, I am working on it. Spring without warning. In November, she went back to visit her old classroom. The new teacher had made it her own, which was as it should be. The cubbies were relabeled with new names. The color wheel posters had been replaced. The supply closet, Caroline's supply closet, the one where she had stood on a March afternoon and read 2 words on her phone, had been reorganized in an entirely different system that she could see immediately was superior to her own, and she felt a specific and generous satisfaction at this, the satisfaction of a thing being in better hands. She walked around the room slowly. She looked at the new self-portraits on the back wall. New children, new faces, new interpretations of themselves. A girl with enormous eyes, a boy who had made his skin bright green, a child who had painted themselves in profile looking at something just outside the frame, something the viewer could not see. And then she saw it, on the back wall, above the cubbies, tacked there with the same 2 pushpins she had always used, Elliot's planet. The purple planet with the silver rings. He had left it. The new teacher had kept it. She did not know whose it was, only that it was extraordinary, and she had not been willing to take down something extraordinary. So it stayed, on the back wall above the cubbies, in the classroom where it had been made, by the child who had needed permission to put down what was really there, and had found it and had put it down without hesitation once he had it. Caroline stood in front of it for a long moment. She took a photograph with her phone. She texted it to Nathaniel with no caption. His reply came in less than a minute. He said, "Yours?" She wrote back, "One of mine." He wrote, "Same thing." She stood for another moment, looking at the planet in its silver rings, and then she put her phone in her pocket and walked out of the classroom. Down the hallway, she had walked 10,000 times, past the water fountains, past the principal's office, past the bulletin board with the fire drill instructions she had read so many times she could have recited them from memory, past the trophy case, past the kindergarten rooms with their construction paper turkeys from last week's holiday, still taped to the windows, bright orange and yellow in the gray November afternoon. She pushed open the front door. She walked out into a November afternoon so sharp and golden it nearly took her breath away. The air was cold, properly cold, the first real cold of the season, the kind that has teeth in it. The light was amber, the particular amber of late November, of a sun that is moving south, that sets earlier every day, that does not have the energy of summer or the drama of October, but has instead a quiet, concentrated intensity, a last brightness before the long dark. The trees along the front walk were bare, almost entirely bare, just a few last leaves trembling on the high branches, bright orange, holding on. She stood on the front steps. She breathed in. She breathed out. The cold air moved through her lungs. She looked at the street, at the cars, at the neighborhood she had driven through twice a day for 6 years, which looked exactly the same as it always had, and which she was seeing somehow as though for the first time. Looking back, it seemed that it's about the same, but it didn't was about the side Tom, and she could look back now, from this side of the winter, from this amber November afternoon. She could see it clearly. She could see that the summer was always going to end. That is what summers do. They are not failures when they end. They are not punishments. They simply end, and the autumn comes, and the leaves fall, and the winter comes after, and the winter is not punishment either. The winter was not punishment. She understood that now. She had thought, when it was happening, in the parking lot, in the closet, in the guest room with the white flower sheets, in the conference room with the paper cup of water, she had thought she was losing something. She had thought of it as loss, as subtraction, as a life being dismantled, piece by piece in a way she could not stop. It was not. It was not loss. It was excavation. It was finding out what was underneath the life she had been living, what had always been there. The west-facing windows that caught the light in a way that still surprised her every afternoon. The round table with the scar placed forward. The kitchen the color of warm sand. The chair from before the marriage that had been waiting in her mother's storage unit, patient and certain of her return. The classroom. The classroom that was never a consolation and never secondary. That had always been the center. That had always been the thing. She had let other things be louder than it for years, and it had simply waited, the way good things wait, for her to come back to herself and hear it again. And Elliot, 9 years old, furious at the world for reasons that may never be entirely clear, who learned on a Thursday afternoon that red and blue make purple, and whose face changed in the specific way that faces change when a person discovers something true about the world, who made a planet with purple hair, no, with purple rings, silver glitter pressed carefully into wet paint with one finger, taking his time, because it was his planet and it deserved his full attention, who left it on the wall because he was done with it, and it was his to leave. She thought about Nathaniel. She thought, he is not the point of this story. And then, he is a very good thing in it. A man who noticed grocery store flowers and meant it, who stood when she walked into a room, who finished his conversation before crossing toward her, who gave her information she needed without asking for anything in return, and who waited patiently at a careful and respectful distance until the right season. She had said yes, simply, without qualification, without searching for the reason it was a bad idea. She had put down what was really there. Life is still worth living, she thought. She did not say it to anyone. She did not post it, or perform it, or find a frame for it. She just thought it plainly on the front steps of her school in November amber light, with cold air in her lungs, and her phone in her pocket, and a new position beginning on Monday, and her mother's voice still warm, somewhere in the back of her memory from this morning's call. She thought it the way you think something that has stopped requiring argument. She thought it the way you breathe. She walked down the steps. She crossed the parking lot. She got into her car. She had a meeting at 2 o'clock, her first official meeting as Director of Education with the Foundation's program officers, to discuss the spring initiative calendar. She had a folder of notes on the passenger seat. She had a cup of coffee in the cup holder, slightly too hot to drink, but getting there. She had 17 minutes. She started the car. She looked at the school through the windshield for one moment, the brick facade, the bright construction paper turkeys still in the kindergarten windows, the bare trees along the front walk with their few remaining leaves. She thought, I taught here for 6 years. I will carry everything I learned here for the rest of my life. She thought, I am going somewhere good. She put the car in drive. She went.
Caroline Marsh started this story with her hands in warm dishwater, washing wine glasses at 11 o'clock at night, looking at her own reflection in the dark kitchen window, filing away a half-second glance that her body already understood, and her heart was not yet ready to name. She started this story doing what so many women do, choosing the kind version of the truth, because the real version was too heavy to carry, and dinner still needed to be made, and tomorrow was a school day, and the forks needed to be straightened, and the flowers were already starting to close. We do this. We file things away. We open the search tab and close it again, and open a recipe website instead, because recipes are manageable, and the other thing is not. We sit in parking lots and count the minutes on a dashboard clock, and then we drive back to work, because there are children waiting, and glitter to be bought, and a small furious boy who has finally finished something and deserves his reward. We keep functioning, long past the point when functioning should have been optional. And this story does not judge that. This story says, I see you. I know exactly why you stayed in the parking lot for 11 minutes instead of 11 seconds. I know exactly why you ironed the shirts on Sunday and made the tea for 2 on the worst night of your life. That is not weakness. That is a woman who was raised to hold things together. who held things together for as long as she possibly could, and who one day, quietly, without drama, without an audience, simply decided she was done. Not because someone told her to leave, not because the evidence finally piled high enough, but because she sat in a closet in the dark, between his pressed suits and her winter coats, and she said out loud to no one, "Starting over feels impossible, but staying is worse." And that sentence, that one small sentence, spoken to hanging fabric and cedar wood in the dark, that was the moment everything changed. Not the confrontation, not the lawyer, not the signed papers, or the sold house, or the new apartment with the west-facing windows. The moment was before all of that. The moment was private. The moment was hers alone. That is what this story is really about. It is not about the betrayal. Betrayal is the inciting event, not the point. It is not about the billionaire. He is a gift the story gives her, not the reason for the story. It is about a woman who spent years making herself smaller, not because anyone forced her to, but because she had slowly, almost imperceptibly, stopped believing she deserved the whole space. Who pressed shirts on Sunday nights and planned next week's dinners and washed the good wine glasses by hand and filed things away in the dark, and who did all of this with love, genuinely, and who was genuinely wronged, but who was also, the whole time, capable of so much more than she was using. The classroom was always there. The children were always there. Elliot, furious and brilliant, making purple planets with silver rings, because that was what the planet needed to be, not what it looked like from the outside, but what it was on the inside. She taught him that. She gave him that permission. She just had not yet given it to herself. The arts coordinator position did not come from the billionaire's connection. It came from 6 years of showing up in a classroom with almost no resources and making something extraordinary happen anyway. It came from the way she watched, the way she noticed, the way she understood that the most important thing a person can learn, child or adult, student or teacher, is to put down what is really there. Not what should be there, not what looks right from the outside. What is actually, honestly, truly there. She had been teaching that lesson for years. The winter taught her to apply it to herself. And that is the thing this story wants to leave with you. Whatever winter you are in right now, whatever parking lot you are sitting in, counting minutes on a dashboard clock, waiting for the courage to drive back into your own life, the spring is not a reward for surviving. The spring is not something that happens to you if you are patient enough, or good enough, or quiet enough. The spring is what you are already growing, underneath everything, underneath the pressed shirts and the closed search tabs, and the tea made for two out of pure muscle memory on the worst night of your life. Underneath all of it, you are already growing. The question is only when you will give yourself the room. Final closing line. This story was carefully researched, built, and hand-edited by our team, crafted with intention to bring you not just entertainment, but meaning, healing, and the quiet reminder that your life is still worth building.